They say the most dangerous enemies are not strangers in the dark, but the ones who share your blood. On my 68th birthday, I received a package that would change everything. No return address, no card, just a plain box sitting on my doorstep. At first glance, it looked harmless. But inside was the most chilling birthday gift of my life, a limited edition bottle of whiskey, worth hundreds of dollars, the kind you'd expect to see locked in a glass cabinet of a collector. Beside it, taped to the side, was a small note. Only 2 words, written in blue ink. Happy birthday. No signature, no warmth. Just handwriting I knew as well as my own heartbeat. My son's. The son I hadn't spoken to in 3 years. For the world outside, this might sound like a touching moment and a strange child finally reaching out. But for me, it felt like a ghost dragging its fingernails across the door. Because that handwriting didn't just remind me of my son. It reminded me of silence, of years without calls, of every holiday chair he left empty. When I saw those letters, my chest tightened, not with joy, not even relief, but something darker, a weight, a warning. The whiskey itself glimmered under the kitchen light, as if fire had been bottled inside. The wax seal smooth beneath my thumb, the label embossed in deep green and gold. It was beautiful, yes, but also mocking, because my son knew something no one else did. He knew I hadn't touched alcohol since the heart attack that nearly killed me 3 years earlier. He had sat in the hospital room when the doctor told me 1 more drink, and it could be your last. That knowledge made the bottle less a gift and more a riddle. I set it on the far side of the table, far enough away so its golden shine wouldn't tempt me. Whiskey used to be my ritual, 1 glass after a long day of repairing fence posts. 1 glass with my late wife Margaret as the crickets sang. But those days were gone, so instead, I thought of someone else. A man who had never failed me. A man who deserved something nice, my old friend and neighbor. Robert Carson. He was the type who showed up at dawn after a storm ripped shingles from my roof, hammer in hand before I even asked. If anyone should savor that rare bottle, it was Robert. So I buckled it into the passenger seat of my Chevy, like it was precious cargo, and drove it to his white clapboard house on the hill. I didn't know it yet, but that decision, the simple act of passing along a bottle of whiskey, was the choice that would draw the curtain back on the darkest chapter of my life. Because what looked like a gift was really a message. A message written not in ink, but in poison. They say betrayal doesn't always come with shouting or slammed doors. Sometimes it comes in silence, in something as ordinary as a bottle passed across a table. I didn't realize that truth until Robert Carson, the man who had been my truest friend for decades, lay crumpled on his kitchen floor, his lips pale, his body shaking as if his heart had forgotten how to keep rhythm. It started innocently enough. The night after I gave him the whiskey, I got a phone call. It was his wife, Linda. Her voice tight like a rope pulled too hard. "Edward," she said, "Robert's in the hospital. He collapsed this morning. They think it might be poisoning." The word didn't make sense at first. Poisoning. Robert wasn't the type to take risks. He didn't experiment with strange foods or swallow pills he didn't recognize. He was as steady as they came. The kind of man who preferred black coffee and bacon. The kind who lived by routine. But Linda's voice cracked as she repeated it. Poisoning. I felt the coffee cup slip in my hand, the warmth draining from it as though the heat itself recoiled from the word. Poison? My eyes darted to the counter, to the spot where the whiskey had sat only hours before, glimmering like some golden prize. My stomach nodded. "Linda," I managed. "Did Robert drink anything unusual last night?" There was a pause on the line. In the background, I could hear the beeping of hospital monitors, the shuffle of nurses, the low murmur of people who spoke in whispers because they didn't want the walls to hear. Then Linda's answer came, soft but sharp as a blade. "The whiskey, the one you gave him." The world seemed to tilt. I stood there in my kitchen, the October light flat and cold through the window, and it felt like I was balancing on the edge of something I didn't yet understand. My mouth went dry. I gave him a taste. I said, my voice hollow, "From the bottle my son sent me." Another silence. Then Linda whispered, "I'll tell the doctors." When the call ended, I didn't move. The house was quiet, but it wasn't peace. It was the kind of quiet that hums, that presses on your ears until you hear the sound of your own blood rushing. My gaze fell to the trash bin in the corner. Something white caught my eye. A small vial. No label. Just a dusting of powder clinging to the inside. I didn't remember throwing it away. My heart stuttered once, a reminder of its fragility, and my hands shook as I picked it up. Then another memory surfaced. Uninvited. My son, 3 years earlier, standing in the hospital room while the doctor leaned close to my bed. "Mr. Harris," the doctor had said, "your heart has scar tissue now. It cannot take much strain. Alcohol, especially whiskey, is off the table. Even one glass could trigger another attack. If you want to see 70, you'll have to live differently." I'd nodded, the weight of those words heavy, and my son, he had been there. He'd heard every syllable. He hadn't argued. He hadn't even looked at me. He just scrolled on his phone, thumbs moving, as though the sentence that had rewritten my future meant nothing to him. I'd told myself at the time he was distracted, too young to carry the fear, too overwhelmed. But standing in that kitchen now, vial in my hand, I realized something darker. Maybe it hadn't been distraction at all. Maybe it had been calculation. Because why else would he send me a bottle of whiskey, a bottle I could never drink, a bottle he knew could kill me if I slipped just once? The thought lodged in me like a splinter. I tried to shake it off. Not everything has a reason, I whispered to myself. But the whisper didn't hold. It never does when the truth is scratching just beneath the surface. I set the vial on the counter, next to the mason jar where I'd poured a little whiskey for Robert before handing him the bottle. The liquid curled against the glass when I tilted it, glowing amber in the light. Harmless, beautiful, tempting, and deadly. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Robert's face, pale and slack, the machines keeping count of the breaths he couldn't take on his own. And behind that image came another, my son's handwriting. 2 words, "Happy birthday." Words that should have healed, but instead cut deeper than any knife. I kept hearing the doctor's voice in my head, looping with my son's silence, with his absence over the last 3 years, with every empty chair at Thanksgiving and Christmas. The gift wasn't an olive branch. It wasn't reconciliation. It was a trap. At dawn, I drove to see my old friend Gary, who ran a veterinary lab outside of town. He owed me a favor from years back, and I needed answers. "Gary," I said quietly, sliding the mason jar across his workbench. "Test this, please." He didn't ask questions. Old soldiers don't. He nodded and took the jar into the lab. The hours stretched like rubber bands, taut and ready to snap. When his call came the next afternoon, his voice was steady but grim. "Edward," he said, "you're not going to like this. There's something in that whiskey. White snake root." The words landed heavy. White snake root, the plant that once poisoned entire families in pioneer days, killing cattle and the people who drank their milk. Invisible, tasteless, lethal. In the right dose, it stops a heart cold. I closed my eyes, the phone heavy in my hand. "Robert drank it," I whispered. "Then he's lucky to be alive," Gary said. "And you might have just dodged a bullet." When the call ended, I sat in the silence of my house, the clock ticking steady, as if mocking me. My hands clenched around the arm of the chair. Betrayal, that's what it was. Not just neglect, not just distance, but betrayal written in my son's own hand. I thought of Margaret, my late wife. I thought of what she would have said if she were here. She'd warned me once, years ago, not to give our boy so much that he forgot to be grateful. And maybe that's exactly what I'd done. Maybe I'd raised him so soft on comfort that he no longer saw me as a father, but as an obstacle. That night, I didn't lock the whiskey away. I didn't throw it out. I placed it in plain view on the kitchen counter, next to the little white vial. A reminder, a monument to the truth I could no longer ignore. My son had sent me poison wrapped in a bow, and whether he meant for me or Robert to drink it, one thing was clear: it had never been a gift. It was a test, and it told me everything I needed to know about where his heart had gone. The phone rang late, later than anyone usually calls. I'd just finished washing the dinner dishes, the smell of onions and roast still lingering in the kitchen. When I picked up the receiver, his voice slid through the line like it had never been absent. "Dad," he said, smooth and casual, as though 3 years of silence could be wiped away with one word. For a moment, I didn't speak. My hand pressed against the counter, steadying myself. Then he said, "Happy birthday," a beat too late, like he had rehearsed it but missed his cue. And then the question came, sharp and insistent. "You got my gift, right?" "Yes," I answered slowly. What do you think? His tone was light, but beneath it I could hear something tight, something wound. "It's a nice bottle," I said. "Beautiful label." I gave it to Robert, figured he'd get more use out of it than me. The silence that followed wasn't a pause, it was a collapse. I could hear him breathing on the other end, slow and deliberate. When he finally spoke, the words had cooled. "You gave it to Robert." "That's right," I replied. Another long exhale, drawn out, measured. Huh. Then the line went dead. I stood there, staring at the receiver in my hand. My stomach twisted, not from the food but from something deeper, something I couldn't yet name. It wasn't just disappointment I had heard in his voice. It was something closer to dread. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house sounded like a whisper. Every tick of the clock mocked me with the truth I didn't want to face. By morning, I told myself I'd imagined it, that fathers invent ghosts in their sons' silences. But then Leah called. She spoke quickly, nervously, like she had been rehearsing the words for hours. "Edward, I don't know what you know, but I need to tell you something." Her voice was tight, the kind that belongs to someone carrying too many secrets at once. "Ethan's been different for a long time." She began, secretive, distant. "He spends hours in the garage with the door shut, says it's just a hobby." But I didn't interrupt. I knew the power of silence, how it pulls the truth out of people better than any demand. She swallowed, her voice cracking. "He keeps jars of dried plants. He labels them with words I don't recognize. Some look like roots. Others, I don't even know. He's joined these online groups about herbal extraction, dosage experiments. He doesn't let me in there. He locks the cabinet." Her words crawled into me, confirming what I already feared. I thought of the little vial in my trash, the whiskey curling golden in the mason jar, the word poisoning echoing in Linda's voice. "Leah," I said carefully, "have you ever heard of white snakeroot?" There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Yes, I've seen it on his search history. He looks up toxic plants." I thought it was just reading something he'd never act on. Her voice trembled. "But after Robert, I don't know anymore." For a moment, I closed my eyes. The images came unbidden: my son as a boy, sitting cross-legged on the living room rug, building models. My son at 16, grinning with grease on his hands as he rebuilt his first car engine. My son on his wedding day, standing tall in a suit, eyes shining with a pride I thought would carry him anywhere. And now this, a man collecting poisons in his garage. I wanted to ask her why she hadn't said anything sooner, why she had let it fester. But I already knew the answer. Fear. The kind of fear that builds quietly in the corners of a marriage. The fear that speaking it aloud will make it real. "Listen to me," I told her. "Don't confront him. Don't mention this call. If you have anything, screenshots, photographs of those jars, keep them. They might matter more than you realize." She was silent for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Why would he do this to you? The question pierced deeper than any accusation. Why? Indeed, money, resentment, control. A son who saw his father not as a man, but as a burden. I let the silence hang before I answered, because if he can't own the story, he'll burn the page. She gasped softly, like the truth itself had stolen her breath. This morning, she admitted, he asked me if I'd heard from you. He wanted to know if you liked the bottle. I told him you'd given it to my father. He didn't say anything, just walked out of the room. I gripped the phone tighter. That pause and that silence. It wasn't nothing. It was everything. Thank you, I said quietly, for telling me. I'm sorry, she whispered back. I'm so sorry. After the call ended, I sat in the kitchen staring at the mason jar on the counter. The whiskey looked innocent, almost beautiful, catching the morning light. But I knew better now. It wasn't just liquor. It was evidence. It was betrayal in liquid form. Later that day, the phone rang again. It was Ethan this time. His voice had softened, almost too much. Dad, he said, we need to talk. Sooner is better than later. I let him speak, wrote down the words on a card, and placed it in the fireproof box with the others. His tone was calm, but I could hear the steel beneath it, the attempt to steer the conversation back into his control. The truth was out now, though. The mask of a concerned son had slipped, and what lay beneath was colder than I ever imagined. Leah's revelations weren't just whispers, they were confirmations, and I couldn't ignore them. Not anymore. That night, I walked through the house with my hands behind my back, checking every lock, every window latch, not because I thought it would keep him out, but because rituals have power. They remind you that you still have control over something, even if it's only the hinge on a door. As I lay down on the couch, the weight of the day pressing on my chest, I repeated the words Leah had spoken: jars of dried plants, locked cabinets, white snake root. The pieces were aligning, and the picture they painted was darker than I was ready to admit. My son hadn't just drifted away. He had built a world of secrets, and in that world, I was no longer father. I was target, and the gift he had sent wasn't reconciliation. It was a warning, a test, a silent declaration of war. I sat alone at the kitchen table, the old oak surface polished by decades of elbows, plates, homework assignments, and late-night conversations. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't bring peace but presses down on you like a weight. The clock ticked above the stove, deliberate and merciless, marking time I could never get back. I stared at the empty mason jar where the whiskey had once glimmered, and for the first time in years, I let myself drift backward. I remembered the early mornings when I left the house before sunrise, boots laced tight, the cold Missouri air biting at my skin as I drove to the factory. Over time, shifts weren't optional. They were survival. Every extra hour meant Ethan could have new cleats for Little League, or Laura could buy the dress she wanted for prom. I never told them how many dinners I skipped, how many times I ate a sandwich on the line instead of sitting at the table, just so their plates would always be full. Margaret used to wait up for me. She'd be sitting on the porch swing, the one with the creaky chains, a cup of coffee in her hand, even if it was midnight. You work too hard, Edward, she'd whisper, her eyes full of worry and pride all at once. And I'd tell her the same thing every time I'm doing it for them. That was the truth. Every overtime hour, every callus, every ache in my back, it was all for Ethan. For the boy I thought would one day stand taller because I'd carried the weight for him. I remembered writing tuition checks, the ink bleeding into the paper like blood from a wound. The numbers made my hands shake, but I signed anyway. $18,000 for the first year, $19,500 for the second. I drove an old truck that rattled like a bucket of bolts because my son needed books in a dorm room. When he called asking for more, saying the cafeteria food wasn't enough, I wired the money without hesitation. Margaret once said softly, "Don't give him so much that he forgets to be grateful." I laughed it off then, told her mothers always worry too much. But now her words came back like a haunting refrain. The wedding, how could I forget $32,000 for a day? Ethan stood there in a suit that cost more than 3 months of my mortgage, smiling like a man who owned the world. I remember looking at him as Leah walked down the aisle and thinking, this is what all the sacrifices were for. This is the payoff. I held Margaret's hand and squeezed, whispering, we did it. She smiled at me, proud and tired. We didn't know then how little time she had left. After Margaret died, the house lost its warmth. I tried to fill it with Sunday dinners, roast chicken, mashed potatoes, apple pie, her recipes, her way of keeping us together. At first, Ethan came. He sat at the table, half engaged, always scrolling on his phone, but at least he was there. Then the excuses started. Busy with work. Dad, can't make it this weekend. One skipped dinner became 2, then months without a visit. By the second Christmas, I realized he wasn't just busy. He was gone, and it hadn't been one big fight that drove him away. It was silence, drip by drip, wearing us down until we barely knew each other. That's what hurts the most, not the absence of love, but the slow erosion of it. Love doesn't always explode, it evaporates. And when it's gone, you're left wondering if it was ever real at all. I sat in that silence now, staring at the ghost of my son in the shadows of the house. How did we get here? How did the boy who once ran to me with scraped knees and wide eyes become the man whose voice turned cold when he learned the poison hadn't touched me? The man who might have wanted me dead? How did my own blood turn into my enemy? The question pulsed in me like a second heartbeat, louder than the ticking clock, heavier than the air itself. It was betrayal, but not just of me. It was betrayal of every sacrifice, every choice I had made. A betrayal of Margaret's faith in us as a family. I remembered the nights when Ethan was sick as a child. I sat at his bedside, a cool cloth on his forehead, whispering stories to distract him from the fever. I remember driving hours in the rain to pick him up from a party because he was too drunk to drive, and he had called me the one he trusted to come. I remembered teaching him how to ride a bike, my hand steady on the seat until he found his balance. For years, I was the net beneath his tightrope, always catching him before he fell. And now it seemed he had climbed high enough only to cut the rope above me. Margaret once told me that parenting was a thankless job, that the rewards were often invisible. We raise them not for gratitude, she said, but for the hope they'll be good people. I believed her. I still do. But sitting there alone, I wondered if I had failed that test. The whiskey bottle wasn't just a gift, it was a message. A cruel reminder that the boy I raised no longer saw me as father, but as burden. That in his eyes, my life wasn't worth protecting. It was worth erasing. I closed my eyes, and Margaret's voice came back to me, softer than the wind. Don't give her so much that she forgets to be grateful. She had been speaking of Laura once, but it applied now to Ethan. I had given and given until there was nothing left to give. And in return, my son had written me a death sentence disguised as a birthday card. The silence of the house pressed closer, the weight of every memory turning the walls inward. I wasn't afraid of dying. I had lived a full life, built a home, loved a woman who had given me more years of happiness than I deserved. What I feared was the truth that my own blood had turned against me, that I had raised not a son, but an enemy. I opened my eyes and stared at the empty jar again. It looked harmless, but it held the truth of everything. I thought about Robert lying in that hospital bed, skin pale against the white sheets, his heart barely holding on. That was supposed to be me. That's what Ethan wanted. And in that realization came something else, something darker but steadier than fear. A resolve. If my son had declared himself my enemy, then I had no choice left but to accept the war he had started. Not with fists, not with fury, but with patience, evidence, and truth. Because the real betrayal wasn't that Ethan had tried to poison me. The real betrayal was that I had loved him more than myself, and he had thrown that love back at me like it was nothing. And as I sat there, the words etched themselves into me like scars. How did my own blood turn into my enemy? I didn't yet have the answer. But I knew one thing: I would not let that question be the last chapter of my life. I wrapped the mason jar in a paper bag like it was something fragile, though in truth it was something far worse. Every time my hand brushed against it, I thought about Robert's face in that hospital bed, the steady hum of machines doing the work his own heart might not manage on its own. The air in my kitchen felt stale, heavy with the silence that had grown louder every day since Margaret passed. That silence now carried a different weight. It wasn't just grief anymore. It was suspicion, evidence, and the kind of truth that can't stay hidden forever. I picked up the phone and called Gary. 30 years ago, he and I had worn the same uniform, boots thick with mud from fields half a world away. Now he ran a small veterinary lab on the edge of town, a place that smelled of disinfectant and hay, a place where he tested for things like parasites in cattle feed, not poison in whiskey. But Gary owed me, and I trusted him. When I told him what I had, he didn't laugh, didn't dismiss me as an old man with too much imagination. He just said, "Bring it by after closing," quietly. That night, I drove out with the mason jar on the passenger seat, buckled in like a passenger I didn't dare lose. The sun had slipped low, painting the road in long strips of golden shadow, the kind of light that makes you wonder what's hiding in between. Gary met me in the parking lot, lab coat draped over a sweatshirt, his face lined with years of work and late nights. He didn't waste words. He just held out his hands, and I gave him the bag. "Just tell me what's in it," I said. He nodded once, his expression tightening as if he already knew it wasn't going to be simple. He disappeared inside, and I sat in the truck, engine idling, the night pressing in on all sides. The minutes stretched like hours. I thought about Ethan's voice on the phone, the pause when I told him I had given the whiskey to Robert. The silence wasn't surprise. It was something colder. When Gary called me the next day, his voice was controlled, but I could hear the heaviness underneath. "Edward, you're not going to like this," he said, using my name the way soldiers do when they need you to focus. "There's something in the whiskey, white snake root. In the right dose, it'll stop a man's heart." I sat very still, the phone pressed hard against my ear. White snake root, the same plant that had poisoned settlers 2 centuries ago. The same plant that killed Abraham Lincoln's mother when cows ate it and passed the toxin into their milk. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't carelessness. It was history repeating itself in the cruelest way possible. I thought of Robert, thought of myself, thought of Ethan standing in that hospital room years ago when the doctor told me no more alcohol if I wanted to live past 70. Ethan had heard every word. He had known exactly what he was doing. I thanked Gary, my voice steadier than I felt, and told him I'd be in touch. But I knew then I couldn't carry this alone any longer. It was bigger than me, heavier than my memories, sharper than my suspicions. It was time to bring in someone whose job it was to deal with this kind of truth. That evening, I called the police department and asked for Detective Reyes. His voice on the line was calm, clipped, the kind of voice that belongs to a man who has heard worse but never stops listening. I told him my name. I told him I believed I had information about a poisoning. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was handing a piece of the weight to someone else. We met in a small office tucked behind the main hallway of the station, a window that looked out on a brick wall. No distractions, no escape. I carried a paper bag in one hand, the mason jar sealed in plastic, and in the other pocket, I carried a small voice recorder, old and scratched, the kind of thing nobody notices until you press play. Reyes sat across from me, sharp eyes that measured everything, a tie that had been straightened too many times that day. He let me speak without interruption. I told him about the package, the handwriting on the card, the whiskey, Robert's collapse, Gary's test. I told him about Ethan's call, the silence that was louder than any word. I told him about the vial I had found in the trash and the way it had vanished without explanation. When I was finished, I placed the mason jar on his desk. Then I set down the recorder. My hand lingered on it for a moment, because it felt like part of me. But I let go. "This is what I have," I said. "This is the truth as far as I can prove it." Reyes didn't touch them right away. He just looked at me, the way men do when they're weighing whether the ground beneath their feet is steady or full of cracks. Then he nodded. "We'll send the liquid to the state lab. We'll make a copy of your audio. If there's cause, we'll move. If there isn't, we'll tell you why we can't." His words were clean, precise, the kind of words that don't promise more than they can deliver, and I found myself grateful for that. But before I left, he leaned forward, his voice lower. "Mr. Harris," he said, "don't speak to your son again until I tell you to. If he calls, note the time, note the words, but keep your answers shorter than his questions. Do not meet him. Do not confront him. Do not give him the chance." The weight of those words sank deep. It wasn't just advice. It was a line drawn in the sand. I nodded, though part of me rebelled at the thought of silence. For years, I had been silent while Ethan drifted further away. Now that silence had turned dangerous, had become a shield instead of a wound. But I understood. This wasn't just family anymore. It was evidence, investigation, law. The bond between father and son had been replaced by something colder, something that demanded I treat him as suspect, not kin. When I stepped out of the station, the air was sharp, the October sky dull gray, the kind of light that makes you squint even when the sun isn't shining. I stood by my truck for a long time, staring at the brick walls, the paper bag now empty in my hand. For the first time since this began, I didn't feel entirely alone. Reyes's words stayed with me. Don't engage. Don't give him the chance. That night, the house felt different, not safer, not less watched, but witnessed. My kitchen table held nothing but a cup of coffee gone cold, but the absence of the jar and the recorder was its own kind of proof. Proof that the story was no longer locked inside my walls. Proof that if Ethan had sent me a message in that bottle, I had answered. And my answer was simple. I wasn't playing his game anymore. I was building my own. As I sat in the stillness, I wrote down the detective's instructions on an index card and placed it inside the fireproof box where I kept every note, every transcript, every shred of evidence I had gathered. The box was nearly full now, each piece a nail in the coffin of denial. For years, I thought my role as a father was to shield my son, to protect him from the world's judgment. But now, my role was different. Now I had to protect the world from my son. And as the clock ticked on, steady and unyielding, I whispered to the empty house, "This is not over, but it will not end the way you wanted." The day the police searched my son's house, the sky was the color of steel. Clouds hung low and heavy, pressing down on the roofs of the neighborhood like a warning. I drove behind the unmarked car that carried Detective Reyes, my hands tight on the wheel, my breath shallow. Every mile felt longer than the last, each turn a step closer to the truth I'd been dreading. When we pulled up to Ethan's house, the blinds were drawn, as though the place already knew what was coming. The yard was neat, the kind of neatness that hides more than it reveals. Toys from Leah's nieces sat in a plastic bin by the porch, though no children had played there in months. To anyone else, it looked ordinary, quiet, safe. To me, it looked like a stage set for betrayal. Reyes motioned for me to stay back. "We'll handle it," he said firmly. But he didn't tell me to leave. Maybe he knew I needed to see it with my own eyes. Maybe he understood that some truths can't be delivered secondhand. The officers moved with practiced precision, one at the front, one circling to the back, a sharp knock on the door, silence, another knock, louder. Then the sound of the ram breaking the lock, a crash that split the morning air in two. They filed in, voices low, weapons ready. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might tear free. Minutes stretched, each one dragging like an anchor. Then came the call from inside clear, another voice. You need to see this. Reyes disappeared into the doorway, and I followed despite myself. The smell hit me first. Not rot, not filth, but earth. Damp, bitter, the smell of roots and dried leaves. The kind that lingers in the back of your throat. The garage was dim, a single bulb casting yellow light over shelves lined with jars. Dozens of them, some big, some small, each neatly labeled with black marker. My eyes caught the letters on more than one WSR, white snake root. I froze, every breath a struggle. It wasn't one jar, it wasn't one mistake. It was an entire collection, a library of poison cataloged and waiting. Beside the jars sat notebooks, pages filled with numbers, ratios, and dates. I picked one up before Reyes stopped me, the paper rough under my fingers. In neat handwriting, my son had documented dosage tests, lines that read 5G, insufficient, 1G, slowed response, 2G, cardiac distress. It was clinical, detached, like a scientist, not a son. My throat closed as I realized these weren't just notes. They were rehearsals, and then, on the workbench, I saw it. A letter, unfinished. The ink still dark as though he'd written it only days ago. The first line was ordinary, Dad, but the second line froze me in place. You'll understand why when it's over. Over. What did that mean? Over my life, over his, over whatever twisted game he believed he was playing. I staggered back, the room spinning. This wasn't suspicion anymore. It wasn't fragments of doubt. It was proof. Reyes took the letter carefully, sliding it into an evidence bag. His jaw was tight, his eyes colder than I'd ever seen them. We've got enough, he said. His voice carried no relief, only the weight of inevitability. That's when I heard the front door slam. 2 officers emerged, dragging Ethan between them. His hands were cuffed, his head held high, his eyes scanning the yard until they locked on me. For the first time in years, father and son stood face to face. I expected anger, or shame, or maybe even fear. What I got was worse. He smiled, not wide, not warm, a thin curl of the mouth, enough to chill me to the bone. Dad, he said softly, almost like a greeting. Then louder, for everyone to hear. This isn't the last chapter. The words hung in the air, heavy, final, but also a promise. My knees nearly buckled. I wanted to shout, to demand answers, to ask him how the boy I raised had turned into the man who stood before me in chains. But the words wouldn't come. My throat was dry, my heart thrashing in my chest. All I could do was stare. The officers led him to the car, his head still turned toward me, eyes locked on mine as if daring me to blink first. For a moment, I saw the boy he used to be, the child who once asked me to read him stories at bedtime, the teenager who used to sit shotgun on long drives to the hardware store. And then I saw the man he had become, eyes flat, expression empty, a stranger wearing my son's face. As the car door slammed shut, the sound echoed like a gunshot. I stood there, the weight of the evidence pressing down on me. The jars, the notebooks, the letter, the smile, the words. This isn't the last chapter. Reyes touched my shoulder gently. We'll take it from here, he said. But we both knew the truth. The law could carry the case forward, but the burden would always remain mine. That night, I sat alone in my house, the fireproof box open before me. I added the copy of the evidence receipt, the photographs of the jars, the transcription of the letter. The box was nearly overflowing now, a coffin of paper and ink. I closed the lid and locked it, the click louder than any thunder. In the quiet, Margaret's voice came back to me. Don't give him so much that he forgets to be grateful. I had given him everything, and in return, he had given me poison. I leaned back, eyes closed, hearing his words again. This isn't the last chapter. Maybe it was meant as a threat. Maybe it was a confession. But to me, it was a scar. A reminder that family can betray you deeper than any enemy ever could. The first sign that Robert was going to make it came one gray morning when I walked into his hospital room and heard him grumble about the food. His voice was still weak, his words slurred by exhaustion. But the sound was alive. "Edward," he whispered, using the old nickname only he had ever gotten away with. "If this is chicken soup, then I'm the Queen of England." Linda laughed through tears, the sound half joy, half exhaustion. I laughed too, because laughter was the only thing left after days of fearing the silence. Robert Carson was stubborn, always had been, and it turned out that stubbornness was stronger than poison. Over the next week, he gained color in his cheeks, his hands steadied, and his eyes, once sunken, began to sharpen again. The doctors said it was remarkable, almost miraculous. I didn't believe in miracles anymore. I believed in slow fights won one heartbeat at a time, watching him breathe without machines, watching him hold Linda's hand with strength instead of weakness. That was enough of a miracle for me. But as Robert's body healed, the world outside the hospital walls turned colder. News doesn't stay quiet in a town like ours. By the time Robert was stable enough to sit up in bed, everyone from the cashier at the grocery store to the mailman had heard the story my son had been arrested and charged with attempted murder against me and against Robert. The headlines were small, tucked under larger stories about politics and crime in the city, but they were there. "Local man charged in poisoning attempt." The words burned like acid. Some papers didn't print his name, but they didn't need to. In a town this size, everyone filled in the blanks. I couldn't walk into the pharmacy without feeling the hush ripple down an aisle. Couldn't stand in line at the post office without catching the side eyes. The whispers muffled, but not enough. Some people looked at me with pity, the kind of pity that feels like a stain you can't wash out. Their eyes said, "How awful." His own son. Others looked at me like I was part of the crime, like somehow the sins of the child had written themselves into the father's skin. And yet, there were a few quiet, careful who met my gaze and nodded. Just a fraction. Respect without words. Not for what had happened, but for the fact that I was still standing. The hardest moment came at church. Margaret and I had been members for decades. I hadn't been every Sunday since her death, but I still slipped into the back row when I could. That week, when I walked in, the whispers felt louder than the organ. Some people wouldn't meet my eyes. Others squeezed my hand too tight, their sympathy spilling out like syrup, sweet but suffocating. After the service, Pastor Green put a hand on my shoulder. "Edward, you're not alone," he said. But as I stood in the parking lot, watching families laugh and gather for Sunday lunch, I felt more alone than I ever had. Because what no pastor, no friend, no neighbor could understand was the truth beating inside me. My son hadn't just betrayed me. He had declared war on me. And that kind of wound doesn't heal with casseroles or prayers. At home, the house felt smaller. Every corner echoed with memory. The bay window Margaret loved caught the light, but instead of warmth, it cast long shadows that seemed to remind me of what I'd lost. I kept the fireproof box close, tucked into the corner of the living room. Each piece of evidence inside felt heavier by the day. Not because it condemned him, though it did, but because it condemned me too. In a way, what kind of father raises a son capable of this? Neighbors tried to help in their own ways. Mrs. Wood Green from down the street left a pie on my porch. I thanked her, though I never touched it. The Johnsons offered to mow my lawn, as if the grass growing too high would be the real tragedy. Others avoided me entirely, crossing to the other side of the street as though betrayal were contagious. But there were moments of quiet support, too. Stephen Carter, the realtor who had once helped me appraise the house, stopped me at the hardware store. "You did the right thing, Edward," he said in a low voice, glancing around as if speaking it too loud might invite judgment. "Takes guts to stand against your own blood when your life's on the line." I didn't answer. Guts had nothing to do with it. Survival did. Still, his words stuck with me. Maybe because they cut against the grain of all the pity. For once, someone wasn't treating me like a broken man, but like one who'd chosen to keep living. The gossip grew. Leah, my daughter-in-law, was stopped in grocery aisles by people asking how she could have lived with him without knowing. Friends she thought she had vanished. She moved in with her parents for a while, carrying the shame of being the wife of the would-be poisoner. It wasn't fair. None of this was fair. But fairness doesn't count for much once a story takes root. And yet, beneath the humiliation and the pity, there was something else in me. Something darker, sharper, a sense that I had drawn a line in the sand, and that by doing so, I had taken back what was mine, my dignity. For years, I had let silence erode the bond with my son, let distance grow until it became a wall. And when the wall finally cracked and revealed the enemy inside, I chose to stand. That choice mattered, even if no one else saw it. One night, weeks after the arrest, I sat on the porch with a glass of water, watching the street lamps hum against the dark. Across the road, I saw two neighbors pause while walking their dog. They glanced my way, then looked quickly back to the sidewalk. For a moment, shame burned hot in my chest. But then, another neighbor, Mr. Taylor, who'd fought in Vietnam, raised his hand in a small salute. Just once. Just enough. My throat tightened, because I knew what he was saying. You fought your battle. You're still here. That's the thing about aftermath. It doesn't come in thunderclaps. It comes in small, quiet moments, the silence of a phone that used to ring but doesn't anymore, the weight of a stare in the grocery aisle, the sudden kindness of a stranger who recognizes the war behind your eyes. Robert's recovery gave me hope. His laughter with Linda, his jokes about the hospital food, his determination to walk again with his cane, those were victories I could hold on to. But every smile of his reminded me too of the cost. He was alive because I hadn't drunk that whiskey, because the poison meant for me had been passed to him. That guilt didn't go away, no matter how many nods of respect I got in hardware stores or quiet salutes from old soldiers. The town moved on, as towns always do. Another crime, another scandal, another piece of gossip would soon take the spotlight. But for me, there was no moving on, only moving through. Every morning I woke up, looked at the fireproof box, and reminded myself I was still alive. Robert was still alive, and Ethan was where he belonged. The cost was my name, my peace, my family, but the reward was breath, and breath is enough. I never went to see him after the arrest. Not at the station, not at the jail, not even at the courthouse where the trial dates were set. Some said I should. Some thought closure required confrontation, that I needed to stand face to face with my son one last time and demand the answers only he could give. But I knew better. Words from him would never heal me. In his eyes, I would always be a burden, a weight he wanted gone. And I wasn't about to beg for mercy from a man who had once been my boy. Instead, I found myself speaking to the silence, to the walls of my home, to the empty chair at the dinner table. I spoke to Margaret, though she was gone, and in some ways, I spoke to Ethan too. Not with anger, not even with pleading, but with the kind of certainty that comes after a storm when the debris settles and you finally see the ground beneath. I was never weak, I said aloud one evening, my voice echoing faintly in the quiet kitchen. The words surprised me with their strength. They didn't come out fragile. They came out steady. I was never a burden. I was always my own man. The words hung in the air, and I realized they weren't just for me. They were a declaration, a verdict I passed not in a courtroom, but in the sanctuary of my own house. My son could strip me of peace. He could drag my name through the gossip mills of our town. He could even try to take my life, but he could not define me. I thought of all the years I had lived before him, the life I had built with Margaret, the sweat and blood poured into a home that had sheltered us, the laughter and love that filled those walls long before betrayal had hollowed them out. Weak, no. I had stood through war, through loss, through the kind of grief that bends most men in half. Burden, no. I had paid my debts. worked my hours, raised my family, carried responsibilities without complaint. My life had been mine. Every sacrifice a choice I made willingly. My identity was not tied to his betrayal. It was forged long before, and it would outlast him. Sometimes at night, I imagined my words slipping through the cracks, finding him in his cell. I pictured him lying on a cot, staring at the ceiling, hearing my voice in the dark. I was never weak. I was never a burden. I was always my own man. Maybe he would scoff. Maybe he would ignore it. But maybe, just maybe, it would echo the way my father's words once echoed in me. Because the truth is, when you raise a child, you leave pieces of yourself in them. Whether they use those pieces for good or evil, whether they honor them or twist them, those pieces remain. And I wanted my words, my truth, to be one of those pieces. I began to write them down. In a notebook I kept near the fireproof box, I wrote page after page, not about Ethan's crimes, not about the evidence or the trial, but about myself, the man I had been, the man I still was, the man no betrayal could erase. Each night, I added more memories of Margaret's smile, of Robert's loyalty, of Sunday afternoons fixing the porch swing, of long drives with the windows down, evidence not of his guilt, but of my life. Evidence that I had lived with strength, not weakness. Neighbors still looked at me with pity, but slowly I stopped flinching under their stares. When Mrs. Green tilted her head, lips pursed in sympathy, I smiled back with a calmness she didn't understand. When men at the diner lowered their voices as I walked in, I lifted my chin and ordered my coffee like I always had, because I wasn't living under their judgment anymore. I was living under my own truth. There's a kind of reconciliation that doesn't happen in conversation. It happens in resolve. I would never reconcile with my son, but I could reconcile with myself. For too long, I had let the question torment me. How did my own blood turn into my enemy? But I realized that question didn't matter anymore. What mattered was this: I was still here. I was still alive, and I was still my own man. That truth became my anchor. Whenever the nights grew heavy, whenever I saw his face in my dreams, I repeated it. I was never weak. I was never a burden. I was always my own man. It was my mantra, my shield, my final word in a war I hadn't chosen but had survived. In time, whispers in town shifted. People stopped talking about the scandal and started talking about resilience. I overheard someone at the grocery store say, "That old man, he stood up when most would have broken." I didn't turn to acknowledge it, but inside, a small flame of pride burned. Not the pride of arrogance, but the pride of survival. And so, in the quiet of my days, I kept speaking those words, not to him, not even to the town, but to myself, and to the memory of Margaret, who had always believed in me. I knew she would have smiled at them, nodded, squeezed my hand, because she had known the truth all along. This wasn't reconciliation with Ethan. That was impossible, but it was reconciliation with Edward Harris. And in the end, that was enough. The night after the verdict, I sat on the balcony of my small apartment overlooking Denver. The city lights stretched out like a map of choices I'd made and roads I'd never taken. For the first time in years, I breathed without weight pressing down on my chest. Robert was home and recovering. Margaret's ring still gleamed in the fireproof box, and the poison that nearly ended me was now locked away as evidence. My son's face still haunted me, but it no longer owned me. I lifted a glass of Bordeaux, the one Margaret had loved, and held it up to the dark. Not in celebration, but in recognition. Recognition that even when the people closest to you betray you, even when blood turns cold, dignity can still be reclaimed. For months, I had asked myself, how did my own blood turn into my enemy? But sitting there, I realized the answer didn't matter anymore. What mattered was survival. What mattered was truth. Betrayal cuts deeper than any knife, but it doesn't get the last word unless you let it. Revenge isn't always about striking back. Sometimes it's about reclaiming your voice, proving you are not weak, not a burden, and never defined by the ones who turned against you. As the wind shifted and carried the smell of autumn wood smoke through the air, I whispered the lesson out loud, maybe for myself, maybe for anyone listening. Family betrayal can destroy trust, but revenge can restore dignity. That was my truth. That was my freedom. And now, I'll leave you with this. If you've ever felt the sting of betrayal, if you've ever questioned your worth because someone you love made you feel small, I want you to hold on to this story. Share it. Save it. Let it sit with you. And if it spoke to something inside, you drop a comment. Tell me where you're watching from, because your voice matters here. Subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter we uncover together. Stories like this one are not just history, they are warnings, lessons, and sometimes the courage we need to keep going. The city kept glowing, and I sat there, steady, knowing that for the first time in a long time, I was not broken. I was whole.